All right, everybody. Welcome back. It's been a while since I put a video up. Today we're going to do another one of the virtual coaching sessions. Subscriber Dan had sent me some data from Autobahn South Course. Wanted me to take a look at it and wanted to compare it to his laps. This is pretty interesting because this isn't a track that I've run much. I used to get out there once a year for the K-Tech event and probably run there 5 times in total, once with the C7 Z06. So we're going to be comparing my Z06 to, or at the time 2015 Z06 to his Grand Sport, C7 Grand Sport. And it's kind of interesting. We're going to actually do two things. We're going to compare both his best lap to my best lap, and then we're also going to take a look at his best lap to his best lap from a week or so ago, because there's some interesting things to see there as well. So, we're going to start right at the beginning. Autobahn South, coming down the front pit straight here, you can see right off the bat that there's a good speed delta between the C7 Z06 and the GS. This is, almost 9 miles an hour coming down the front straight. But, here you can see, frankly, I lifted really early. So I lifted here at 92 feet. And Dan stays in the gas all the way down to 48 feet. So another 150 feet longer on the gas. And the result is, while there's still the Z06 was faster, this time bump is pretty interesting because at the time he lifts, there's a small time advantage to the Z06, 7/100ths of a second. But it's pretty close. He's able to make up most of the speed gap at the end of the straight just by staying in the gas longer. And you can see going to the brakes, again, I brake earlier. He brakes much later, much more aggressively. It's very good. So, coming down the turn one, clearly his experience is showing. And as we come down towards the apex of turn one, a couple of things here. So, first you can see I'm a little inconsistent in my speed, but I do, even at the very minimum, I'm able to carry a good 5 or so miles an hour through the apex of turn one. So for Dan, if you can just try to carry that speed longer and not quite slow as much going around turn one, that would definitely pick you up some time. And you can see we're starting to see this curve go back up again. So in the compare time line down here, when the blue is above the red, it's basically the GS is slower. There's places we're going to see where the blue is below the red, so that's where the GS has actually started turning a faster lap. And so here, let's take a look at kind of the apex of turn one. A couple of interesting things. He gets back on the gas much more aggressively, much more assertively, but has to lift here mid-corner. So I don't know actually if that is an intentional thing to rotate the car, or whether maybe he felt the car get squirrely. Unfortunately, we don't have yaw data or wheel speed data for the GS to actually look at to see whether it was a kind of a fundamental thing or this was a driver technique. But you can see he kind of pops off real quickly and then pops back on the gas. But the result is you now have this where the speeds are prior to him jumping off the gas pretty much exactly the same, 60 and 61. That little drop creates a huge speed gap of about 5 miles an hour. And so that really allows the Z06 to start gaining a little bit of time just because that small area with a much higher speed. And so, as we're exiting the turn 1-2 complex, the Z06 has got nearly a half a second on the GS. And most of that was actually through turn one. As you can see, there was very little time difference kind of going into turn one. So here you can see we're very similar going through turn two, and I believe this is turn 3 up here, $1 Million Corner that we've just gone through. And then again, we have this short straightaway from turn 3 to turn 4, and again, you see the same thing that happened in turn 1. I lifted really early. He lifted much later, and the speeds are actually pretty similar up until that point as well. So you can see it's 101, 101 when I lift, but he waits much longer to lift. He's got a good 4 miles an hour at this point when he lifts, and that then starts to claw back the speed. The other big difference here is I way overslowed for, I believe this is turn 4. It's a fast left-hand sweeper. I mean, look at this huge speed delta here. It's what, 11 miles an hour here. There's places where it's 12, 13 miles an hour in speed difference. So Dan did a great job of carrying speed through that high-speed left-hand sweeper, and really, as a result, gained a lot of time back. So at this point, we're back to being just about even. The GS actually has a 7/100ths advantage overall on the lap at this point. And again, heading into the next corner, same exact scenario. I lifted early. He stayed on the gas later. And again, through the next corner, more of the same. So he's got a higher mid-corner speed and actually gets back to the gas sooner and carries a lot more speed all the way through the turn 5 complex there. And you can see it again in the speed trace. Not only is the line higher, it stays, continues rising longer. And the result is really by the time we get down to kind of turn 6 here, the GS has not only clawed back the half a second the Z06 had at the end of the turn 1-2 complex, it's gained another half a second. So he's a full second faster through this section of course here, from 2 to 6. So that's fantastic. That's really great. Interestingly enough, entering turn 6 here, you can see the roles are reversed a little bit. I actually do a better job of carrying the mid-corner speed. So we've got these speed deltas of, again, looking at the data here, 4 miles an hour or so through that sweeper to the right-hand side. And then we're both back on the gas. And we both stay fairly even once we're back on the gas. So he gets back on the gas a little earlier, a little more assertively. He's able to start accelerating. And you can see, again, these speed traces stay dead even until he has to shift. At this point, kind of drops off a lot with the shift. One thing I'd suggest trying is a no-lift shift. I'm trying to remember how much of a curve there is. I think you are truly straight at that point. So if you can just keep the foot gas floored, do that 3-4 up shift, that might prevent you from losing quite as much speed there. But then we continue, and you can see, again, I actually lift a little bit here in the Z06, whereas he's continuing to stay full throttle. So approaching, leaving turn 7, approaching 7/8 here, you can see, again, same scenario. I lift earlier, he stays on the gas much longer, and at this point he's, we're kind of closing back in here just because of the speed differential of the Z06, and braking. I believe this is the entrance to patience here. Again, we're back to a fairly even speed. Our braking techniques are very similar. Again, though, he kind of overslows on this first right-hander that goes into patience. They call it patience for a reason, though. There's not a lot of grip there, and part of the goal is to get your car really well set up for the next left-hander. But clearly, from a timing advantage or from a speed advantage, the fact that I was able to go 6 miles an hour faster through as a min speed definitely helped. And you can see our speed traces through the rest of patience are very similar. So it was just a matter of carrying that speed through. So here we are. We're exiting patience. You can see this. He's got this pesky Mustang up in front of us. That's really going to play into this as well. I probably should have said right up front that the lap difference between the two cars, my best was a 1:33.7. His was a 1:35.6, I believe. So very similar, about a 2-second delta between the cars. And frankly, he could have actually been a lot closer. You'll see this Mustang comes into play later. But here, just the raw horsepower and the torque of the Z06, even though our min speeds are about the same, you can see this big difference in straight line speed. At the end of the straight here, we've got speed differences of, 7 miles an hour, and you're carrying that over a very large segment of the track. Again, I lifted earlier than he did, so good on him for carrying the speed longer. The braking traces, or the speed trace during braking, look very similar, except for right about here. Again, you see a lot more slowing at the end of the back straight here. And I presume that's because he was coming up on that Mustang and frankly had to slow to avoid hitting that Mustang. So again, very similar from there, similar speeds. Again, he actually carries a little more speed, stays in the gas longer in this kind of 12-13 stretch here. And we're back heading into the front straight. He carries good job carrying more speed. Again, I'm able to get on the throttle a little bit earlier. I don't have a car in front of me like he does. And again, here you see this big speed differential just from the Z06. So, probably that Mustang cost him a few tenths there for sure from slowing down. But most of the time that I gained on him was a function of the horsepower. So if we just look at the back straight, you can see it went from a 0.3 seconds delta to 1.9. So what is that? 9/10 of a second was basically made up on the back straight. And then again, this is much like the VIR video I did with the GS, where on the front straight you see that 1.46 up to 1.92. So another half second there. So again, that's where most of the time was gained. He did a really good job here. Again, you could gain a little bit by just carrying more mid-corner speed in that first part of patience there, and also back in turn 6. But for the most part, he really exceeded my abilities as far as kind of carrying good speed and rolling it through mid-corner. So great job there. And that's the comparison of the Z06 lap with the GS lap. So what we're going to do now is, again, I've loaded 3 laps up here. And we've hidden his lap from his most recent one from about a week ago. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to hide my Z06. Hide outing. We're going to go ahead and unhide his. And then we got to rejigger a couple of things here. So for instance, this video pane has now got to be connected to his new lap. And now we're going to go through the same thing, but we're going to look at the difference between his lap last week, his best lap last week, and his lap last fall, which was his best lap. So from a time perspective, we're talking about a 1:37.13 and a 1:35.68. And I think I misspoke earlier when I talked about the lap times for the Z06. So I did a 1:33.7. He did a 1:35.68 or 7. So again, 2-second delta. But let's take a look and compare these 2 laps. Why was he, what was that, second and a half slower? Is that what that works out to? And it's interesting because he had newer brake pads. He had super sport tires, so I think tires as opposed to cups definitely had an effect on this. But from an overall driving technique, let's see what was different between the 2 laps. So first of all, the orange line is the most recent one, and again you can see coming down the front straight, we do have a definite speed difference. So coming into this lap, there was definitely probably could have gotten back to the throttle sooner coming onto the front straight. And you also have to realize from these compare times, these are relative to the Z06. So they're very similar though as far as the deltas. So 0.07 to 0.09 basically means they're 0.02 apart. And again, very good job at getting off the gas, getting on the brakes, exact same place. You can see from a braking technique, he's actually braking a little less as far as pedal position. So it's one thing to remember about this data set is the brake pressure we're seeing is not actual brake pressure, it is pedal pressure. So it's kind of interesting to look at this, and we're going to zoom in for a second, you can see there is that speed delta on the front straight, but then there's also this big speed delta where effectively he's starting from a slower speed and he's slowing a little bit at a higher rate. So as a result, there's this big speed difference all the way through the braking zone. So for instance here it's 9 miles an hour, the difference in speed, as they're braking down into 1. So the interesting thing is, whereas the times are pretty much similar when we go to brake, when we get down the minimum speed at turn 1, the time has now changed quite a bit. So there's 0.3 that were gained just in that braking zone on his best lap over his lap last weekend. So let's actually try adding another channel here and see what we get. So do Alt-2, let's add longitudinal acceleration. And we're going to have to do something else real quick here just so I can rescale it. And try to put this someplace we can see it more clearly. So you'll see longitudinal acceleration here is actually pretty similar. So there's no real difference. There's small differences. Again, his rate of deceleration is slightly higher through here, lower through here. So that doesn't appear to be much of a factor. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that channel I just added, but I did want to take a look at that kind of in real time. So zooming back out, we're now in turn 1, and again, you can see from a speed perspective, it's interesting. He has less throttle, so this is possibly a function of the tires. The Super Sport's just not giving him as much forward grip. Could just be a lack of confidence in the way the car felt. But the result, again, is this big speed gap coming out of turn 1, heading towards turn 2. Again, turn 2 to $1 million corner, same thing. See these big speed deltas of kind of 3, 4, 5 miles an hour that you're carrying pretty much everywhere you're doing a mid-corner situation. And the result is those things are all costing time. So by the time we come out of turn 3, there's a, what is that? Almost 6.5 tenths difference between his best lap last time and his best lap this time. And it's all a function of that mid-corner speed. Same thing here, heading into turn 4. Again, you see these big dips in the speed. That's what's costing your time. And again, these lines are moving the way they are up and down because they're actually being compared to that Z06 lap still. So while the gap between the lines is bigger, it's moving down because it's closer to that Z06 line that we've hidden. So if you look at the lap overall, it's largely the same trend over and over again. It's overslowing heading into the corners, and then while he's getting back at the gas at the same time, and he's slowing it with largely the same braking technique. I mean, this is interesting. If you look at his brake traces and his throttle traces, they're pretty consistent. This is 2 different events, but different tires, different brake pads, and I think really it's a function of just recalibrating kind of your pedal and your senses a little bit to carry more speed. So this is one of those things that it's good that you've got kind of the muscle memory to know what to do lap after lap, and now it's a matter of actually looking at the data after each session, looking and seeing where am I losing that time, and then trying to be very conscious about not slowing as much going into these corners and try to roll more speed mid-corner through the corner. And that's really the story of this lap. So he was doing everything exactly the same. The car was performing well. It was just a function of having to adjust to the different tires and the different brakes, basically having the car perform slightly differently, even though his technique was largely exactly the same. So that's it. I mean, I think the moral of the story here again is rolling that speed mid-corner, adjusting your technique to the equipment, and then just looking at your data and seeing where you are session after session. So probably the next video I do will actually be on that. I'll go through my own process for how I download the data and how I catalog things in between sessions. So hopefully that'll be helpful to folks. So that's it. Have a great day.